When choosing car parts for repair, it can be hard to decide whether to use OEM or aftermarket components. Don't waste your money on products that don't work or spending too much on products that go overboard. This guide will show you whether or not it's worth it to buy OEM parts, whether new or used, or cheap or expensive aftermarket parts. We won't be increasing the performance, just getting cars back on road or ready to sell again. Parts that I always get new OEM from the dealership are as follows. Maintenance fluids and filters. A general rule of thumb is you're going to want to get these parts from the dealership. Fluids like transmission fluid, transfer case fluid, differential fluid, coolant, any sort of filters that go along with anything, these are the things you're going to want to get from the dealership. Engine oil, air filters, you want to get these from the dealership. Do your research before switching the engine oil to an aftermarket alternative. On some of my vehicles that I own, I do switch to a Mobil 1 engine oil filter and engine oil. This is good for the specific old application that I have, but be sure to do your research and make sure you can change and that the aftermarket filter is as high quality as what's designed for the vehicle. The next part you're going to want to get direct from the dealership are vital engine, transmission, differential, and transfer case rebuild parts. On the same topic, unless a known failure is there, you're going to want to get all gaskets and RTV from the dealership direct. I would also get all suspension parts, whether front end or rear end, from the dealership direct. This would include any leaf springs, shocks, tie rods, anything like that. You could go aftermarket in a pinch, but if you're going to keep this vehicle for long term, I highly recommend going to the original OEM for the suspension components for the most premium ride and general longevity. The next part I always get from the dealership are new key fobs, and I always have the dealership program them. I have seen aftermarket key fobs fail. I highly recommend getting the dealership ones. They are expensive, especially new ones, but if you have maybe a 10-year-old car, they can be a little cheaper, but the new push-button security systems can get quite expensive. And I know it can be tempting to get the aftermarket, but I always want to get the dealership key. Any parts related to the airbag system, you're going to want to get from the dealership. Don't mess around with safety items, though you can get these items used in some instances. And these are the parts I buy OEM used, usually on eBay. Interior electronics, like the stereo system, window controls, locks, anything like that. When these parts don't rely on any sort of safety function and they just need to work, you can save a ton by trying to get a used part from junkyards or even on eBay. In line with the interior electronics is anything to do with the HVAC system. You can probably get these parts used to save some money. You could go aftermarket, but I have found poor reliability and maybe even loud noises or comfort factors that the aftermarket doesn't address that OEM can. And if you have an older vehicle, maybe you just want to go OEM used. If you ever need to replace a body panel, I always look at the used market first, especially because you don't have to deal with paint. If you can get a color matched to your vehicle, and it looks a whole lot better than those plastic body panels that cost way less. I would also look for used components with anything to do with the intake system, whether it's duct work, the airbox, the actual intake component itself. I would get new gaskets if it ever needed it, but looking at the used market can save you tons of money on these, especially these plastic intake components. For more common models, headlights can be purchased on the cheap aftermarket, but sometimes some high-end luxury models require OEM-specific headlights. Any sort of module involving the engine, transmission, transfer case, or differential could be purchased used OEM. I think that's a great option, or you could go new. The next category of parts I'm going to talk about is paying top dollar for aftermarket parts. Kind of goes hand in hand with OEM sometimes, but sometimes the aftermarket does it better. Brake pads and rotors. I'm totally okay going aftermarket, buying the most high-end brake pads and rotors that fit your budget and application. I drive in the mountains a lot, and I've had bad luck with OEM brake pad quality and rotors warping. So the aftermarket, I spend a little bit more, which is actually usually less than OEM, but it is pretty expensive for the aftermarket, and they last a lot longer. The next part I would consider getting aftermarket, but expensive, is spark plugs. They last a long time, and a high quality spark plug will give you a nice quality burn and keep the engine running healthy. The next part I wouldn't skimp on, but maybe better aftermarket than OEM, is your car battery. Get one that you can replace easy with whatever the dealership or the local parts store near you has, so that you can replace it under warranty pretty easy. But also, just get a high quality one that'll last 5 to 7 years. Maybe don't go for the cheapest one possible, because you'll just be stranded by the time you find out that it's bad. Another part with similar guidelines is ignition coils. I don't go for the high-end one, but I definitely don't go for the cheapest one. I go for a nice mid-level one at my local parts store. That way it's under warranty and I can replace it in the future if I ever need to. I would probably go higher end than lower end on this category, which is why I'm putting it under this expensive aftermarket category. When I'm buying new tires, I spare no expense. I buy the exact tire that I want for my exact application. This is one of the best ways you can stay safe on the road, and you shouldn't skimp on this ever. And the final category of this guideline are parts that you can buy cheap on the aftermarket. These are things where you can save a couple bucks on and still get the job done. Interior plastic components. These things you can if you can find an aftermarket for these, they're going to be a lot cheaper, as OEM is going to jack the price up for anything like this. For example, this shift knob would probably be a lot more expensive from the dealership than it was on Amazon. Other things like trim pieces or possibly even buttons could be replaced on the aftermarket. Sometimes even used, you can get a good price on. I touched on headlights and taillights earlier. These, on older models, you can easily get cheap on the aftermarket from your local parts store. For example, taillights on early 2000s vehicles are a great way to save a few bucks, whether you're buying a cheap version off of eBay, Amazon, or if your local parts store has one that's cheap enough. High performance vehicles and luxury vehicles may need a very specific head or tail light, so make sure you do your research before buying it. Window regulators. I have had great luck replacing window regulators with the cheapest one I can find on the internet, whether it's Amazon, carparts.com, eBay. The OEM ones are pretty expensive. You can find used ones, but I've had good luck with they're so cheap that I figure if I can replace it in a few years, it's still worth it because they're so affordable. So I buy window regulators, cheapest I can find on the internet. Oil pans. These can be a great alternative to save a few bucks on, especially if you're using a gasket or RTV anyway. The oil pan is just going to hold the oil. As long as it's a safe material, it should be great. So if you could save, a significant amount of money, you might want to consider that. The only caveat with oil pans is that sometimes the new oil plug is specific to that aftermarket oil pan. For example, if you damaged your oil plug or you lost it and you just threw in an OEM one, you might actually damage the aftermarket oil pan threads, causing you more problems. So something to consider, but aftermarket oil pans, you can save a few bucks. And finally, any plastic pins, fender hardware, any sort of weird hardware. Sometimes you got to go OEM because it's so unique, but anything generic, get those from your local parts store. Sometimes sourcing parts can be difficult to decide which route to go, but following this guide will give you a general idea. Nothing's set in stone. Some parts for some models are good one way, some parts for another model are good a different way. So use this as a guide, and depending on your application will really depend on who you're sourcing the parts from. So if you found this video helpful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions at all, please leave a comment and I'll do my best to get back to you. Any additional links will be provided in the video description.